The morning of June 19th, 1944, somewhere over the Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Saipan, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu gripped the stick of his F6F Hellcat, his eyes fixed on the radar scope in the ready room just minutes earlier, watching the blips multiply like a spreading infection across the screen. 430 Japanese aircraft, they'd been told. The largest carrier strike force Japan had launched since Midway. Vrasiu climbed through 20,000 feet, the Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine thrumming with 2,200 horsepower beneath him. Around him, 220 Hellcats formed into position, a steel curtain rising to meet an enemy that had once swept across the Pacific like a divine wind. Below, the grey shapes of American carriers steamed in perfect circles, protected by a battle line of cruisers and battleships, whose anti-aircraft batteries bristled like steel porcupines. The Japanese pilots climbing toward this formation believed they were flying into the decisive battle that would save the empire. They had been told their land-based aircraft had already softened the American fleet. They had been promised that the legendary skills of Japanese naval aviation would overwhelm the Yankees. They had been assured that this would be their Tsushima, the battle that would turn the tide of the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. Within 6 hours, nearly 500 Japanese aircraft would be burning in the Pacific, 3 carriers would be at the bottom of the sea, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to conduct carrier warfare would be extinguished forever. The Hellcat pilots waiting in the tropical sky would achieve something unprecedented in the history of aerial combat, a kill ratio so lopsided that one pilot would later remark it was like an old-time turkey shoot down home. This was the moment when Japanese admirals would learn that their careful plans, their faith in spiritual determination, and their belief in the inherent superiority of Japanese fighting spirit meant nothing against American industrial might, superior technology, and pilots who had trained for 2 years instead of 2 months. The transformation from Japanese confidence to Japanese catastrophe would unfold in a single day of carnage that would echo through the rest of the war, but the seeds of this disaster had been planted months earlier, in the smoke-filled conference rooms of Tokyo, where men who should have known better convinced themselves that one more battle and one more decisive engagement could still change the course of a war that was already lost. March 31st, 1944. Off the coast of Mindanao in the Philippines, Admiral Minechi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, boarded a Kawanishi flying boat for what should have been a routine flight to the Palau Islands. His Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, climbed into a second aircraft, carrying in his briefcase the most sensitive documents in the Japanese Navy, the Z Plan, Japan's strategy for the decisive battle that would save the empire. Koga's plane flew directly into a typhoon and crashed. Everyone aboard died. Fukudome's aircraft also crashed, but he survived, washing ashore on Cebu Island. Filipino guerrillas found him and, more importantly, found his briefcase. Within weeks, the Z Plan was in the hands of General Douglas MacArthur's Military Intelligence Service in Brisbane, then forwarded to Admiral Chester Nimitz in Hawaii, and finally distributed to every fleet commander in the Pacific. The Americans now knew exactly what the Japanese would do. They knew the Japanese would seek a decisive carrier battle near the Marianas or the Carolines. They knew the Japanese would rely heavily on land-based aircraft to supplement their carrier strength. They knew the Japanese would attempt feints and flanking maneuvers to catch the American fleet out of position. The Z Plan had handed the Americans a roadmap to Japanese thinking, and Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Koga's replacement, would follow that roadmap with almost religious devotion. Toyoda was a brilliant officer, a torpedo and naval artillery expert who had actually opposed war with the United States, believing it unwinnable. But duty compelled him to execute the plans his predecessors had developed, to seek the decisive battle that naval doctrine demanded. He renamed the Z Plan as Operation A-Go and waited for the Americans to make their move. He would not wait long. June 11th, 1944, over the Marianas Islands. Commander David McCampbell led his Hellcats in a sweeping dive toward the airfields of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Intelligence had reported only 50 Japanese aircraft defending the islands. The Americans had come with over 200 fighters and dive bombers, and they meant to annihilate every aircraft within range of the upcoming invasion. The slaughter was methodical. Zeros rose to meet the attackers, their pilots pulling maneuvers that would have seemed miraculous 2 years earlier. But these were not the veteran pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor or fought at Coral Sea. These were hastily trained replacements, men who had received perhaps 3 to 6 months of flight training compared to the 2 years of intensive instruction that every American pilot had undergone. The Hellcats carved through them like scythes through wheat. Superior speed allowed American pilots to dictate every engagement, diving from altitude, making a single pass, then climbing away before the more maneuverable Zeros could turn to engage. The Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower, while its armored cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks kept pilots alive even when hit. The Zero, for all its elegance and maneuverability, would burst into flames from a single burst, its unarmored fuel tanks turning the aircraft into flying pyres. When the smoke cleared after 2 days of strikes, approximately 130 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed on the ground or shot from the sky. American losses totaled 11 aircraft. The Americans had achieved complete air superiority over the Marianas before a single Marine had waded ashore. This should have been decisive intelligence for Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the 1st Mobile Fleet, the man who would lead Japan's carrier forces into battle. But Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, commander of the decimated land-based squadrons, failed to report the destruction to his superiors. In one of those inexplicable lapses that doom military campaigns, Kakuta allowed Ozawa to sail toward battle, believing his land-based aircraft were intact and ready to attack the American fleet. Ozawa was sailing toward catastrophe, and he had no idea. June 15, 1944. The beaches of Saipan. 20,000 United States Marines of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions stormed ashore under a thundering naval bombardment. The island was critical. Its capture would place the Japanese home islands within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. For the first time in the war, Tokyo itself would be vulnerable to strategic bombing. Japan could not afford to lose Saipan. In Tokyo, the Imperial War Council made their decision. This would be the decisive battle. Every available ship would sail. Every carrier still afloat would launch. Operation Eigo was activated. The fate of the Empire, Admiral Toyoda declared, rested on this one battle. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa received the order from his flagship Taiho, the newest and most powerful carrier in the Japanese fleet. Taiho was a marvel of naval engineering. The first Japanese carrier with an armoured flight deck, designed to withstand bomb hits that would cripple other vessels. Her extensive command facilities made her the perfect flagship. Her torpedo blisters promised protection from submarine attack. Ozawa commanded an impressive force on paper: 9 carriers, 3 fleet carriers, and 6 light carriers. 5 battleships, including the mighty Yamato, 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 28 destroyers, and approximately 430 carrier aircraft, supplemented by what he believed were over 500 land-based aircraft on Guam, Rota, and Yap. The Americans had 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. Their 900 carrier aircraft included the F6F Hellcat, a fighter that had been designed specifically to kill Zeros, and it was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. But Ozawa had advantages too, or so he believed. Japanese carrier aircraft had longer range than their American counterparts. The Zero could reach targets 300 miles away, while the Hellcat's combat radius was barely 200 miles. This meant Ozawa could strike the Americans from positions where American aircraft could not reach him. He could launch his attacks, retire westward, and force the Americans to chase him deeper into Philippine waters, away from Saipan, where his land-based aircraft could join the battle. It was an elegant plan. It might have worked in 1942, when Japan's pilots were the most experienced in the world, when American fighters were inferior, when the mystique of Japanese invincibility still held power. But this was 1944. Everything had changed, and Ozawa was about to learn how completely the balance of power had shifted. June 18, 1944. Evening. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, reviewed the submarine reports on his flagship Indianapolis. 2 American submarines, Flying Fish and Seahorse, had spotted Japanese carrier and battleship forces emerging from the Philippines, heading east toward Saipan. The decisive battle was at hand. Spruance faced a dilemma that would haunt him for decades. His primary mission was to protect the invasion forces at Saipan. The Marines ashore depended on naval gunfire support and air cover. The supply ships and transports anchored off the beaches were vulnerable targets. If he steamed west to attack Ozawa's carriers, he might be lured away from Saipan, allowing a Japanese flanking force to attack the beachhead. The Japanese had used such tactics before. At Midway, they had attempted to divide the American fleet with feints and diversions. A captured document emphasized this Japanese preference for splitting their forces and attacking from multiple directions. Spruance would not be baited into abandoning his Marines to chase after carriers. He made his decision. Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, would position itself west of Saipan and wait. The Japanese would have to come to them. And when they came, they would face a defensive arrangement so formidable that even experienced pilots would struggle to penetrate it, let alone the barely trained replacements that now filled Japanese cockpits. Vice Admiral Willis Lee's battle line would form the outer ring, 7 fast battleships and 8 cruisers packed with anti-aircraft guns, creating a wall of steel and fire 15 miles in front of the carriers. Behind Lee, Mitcher's carriers would steam in tight circular formations, each group positioned for mutual support. Any Japanese pilot who survived the combat air patrol would face Lee's guns. Any who survived Lee would face the carrier's own anti-aircraft batteries. It was a defensive arrangement designed to massacre attacking aircraft, and it would function exactly as designed. June 19, 1944, 04:30 hours. Aboard the Taiho, Admiral Ozawa reviewed his battle plan one final time. The American fleet lay somewhere to the east, perhaps 250 miles distant. His reconnaissance aircraft would locate them at dawn. Then the strikes would begin. Ozawa had divided his forces into 3 groups. His own A force, built around the heavy carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, would steam farther west, using the longer range of carrier aircraft to hit the Americans from beyond their reach. B Force, under Rear Admiral Takagi Joshima, with the carriers Junyo, Hyo, and Ryuho, would operate closer to the battle area. C Force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, formed the vanguard, screening the carriers with battleships and cruisers. It was a sound arrangement, operationally elegant, but it rested on assumptions that were no longer true. Ozawa believed his land-based aircraft were ready to attack. They had been annihilated. He believed his pilots were adequately trained. They had received a fraction of the training their American opponents enjoyed. He believed Japanese fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages. It would not. At midnight, Ozawa issued his final message to the fleet. This operation has an immense bearing on the fate of the Empire. It is hoped that all forces will do their utmost and attain results as magnificent as those achieved in the Battle of Tsushima. Tsushima, the great naval victory of 1905, when Admiral Togo had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet and established Japan as a great power. Every Japanese naval officer knew that battle by heart, studied its tactics, dreamed of replicating its glory. Ozawa was invoking that sacred memory, calling upon his men to achieve the impossible. Within hours, he would learn that Tsushima was not waiting in the Philippine Sea. Only annihilation lay ahead. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea with the promise of perfect flying weather, clear skies, unlimited visibility, calm seas, conditions that would allow American radar to detect incoming aircraft at maximum range and allow Hellcat pilots to see their targets from miles away. At 05:30, Ozawa's reconnaissance aircraft fanned out to locate the American fleet. By 07:30, they had found it. The scout pilots radioed the position, course, and estimated composition of Task Force 58. 15 carriers, they reported. 7 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers. A target so rich that even a partially successful strike might cripple American carrier power in the Pacific. Ozawa gave the order. Launch the first strike. Between 0830 and 0850, 69 aircraft lifted from the decks of Kurita's van force carriers, 16 fighters, 45 bombers, and torpedo planes. They formed up, circled to gain altitude, then set course east toward glory and death. They had no idea that American radar had been tracking them since launch. They did not know that every carrier in Task Force 58 had scrambled its fighters. They could not imagine that 220 Hellcats were climbing to intercept them, forming a layered defense that would shred any formation that approached. At approximately 1000 hours, 55 miles from the nearest American carrier, the first wave of Japanese aircraft encountered the first wave of Hellcats. The massacre had begun. Commander David McCampbell led 12 Hellcats from the Essex against the vanguard of the Japanese formation. His pilots had trained for this moment for 2 years, practicing gunnery against towed targets, mastering deflection shooting, learning to exploit the Hellcats' strengths against the Zero's weaknesses. They dove from altitude, building speed to over 380 miles per hour, far faster than the Zeros could manage. The Japanese formation broke apart immediately. Instead of maintaining cohesion and mutual support, individual pilots attempted to dogfight with the Hellcats, turning hard to bring their guns to bear. It was exactly the wrong tactic. The Hellcat could not turn with a Zero at low speed, but at high speed, with altitude to burn, American pilots simply zoomed back up after each pass, leaving the Zeros clawing for altitude and speed they could not achieve. McCampbell's guns hammered out their rhythm. 6 50-caliber machine guns firing over 3,000 rounds per minute combined. Zeros exploded, caught fire, spiraled into the sea. Some Japanese pilots attempted the traditional head-on pass, a tactic that had worked against Wildcats early in the war, but the Hellcat's armor turned aside 20mm cannon shells that would have killed a Wildcat pilot. American pilots pressed their attacks to suicidally close range, absorbing hits that would have downed earlier fighters, then watching as their return fire tore unarmored Zeros apart. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese strike, only 27 survived to continue east toward the carriers. They flew directly into Vice Admiral Willis Lee's battle line. Lee's 7 battleships had been positioned specifically for this moment. Their 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire at ranges exceeding 2 miles, filling the sky with exploding shells equipped with VT proximity fuses, a top-secret weapon the Japanese knew nothing about. The shells would detonate automatically within lethal range of an aircraft, no direct hit required. The sky became a wall of shrapnel and explosive force. More Zeros fell, more bombers disintegrated. The Japanese pilots pressed on with incredible courage, ignoring losses that would have broken less determined men, driving toward the carriers they could now see on the horizon. But courage without adequate training, without armored aircraft, without numerical advantage, was simply not enough. By the time the surviving aircraft reached Montgomery's carrier group, barely a dozen remained. They attempted scattered attacks, making near misses on carriers Wasp and Bunker Hill, causing casualties but no serious damage. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers themselves shot down 8 more aircraft. Of the 69 aircraft in the first strike wave, 42 had been destroyed. Not a single American carrier had been hit. Not a single bomb had found its target. The Japanese pilots who survived turned for home, some heading for Guam to refuel, others attempting the long flight back to their carriers, their formations shattered, their confidence destroyed. And this was only the beginning. 3 more strike waves were already in the air, heading toward the same buzzsaw that had just chewed up the first attack. Ozawa, sitting in Taiho's Combat Information Center, had no idea what had just happened. His radio operators reported attacks in progress, bombs away, American carriers under attack. None of it was true. The pilots were reporting what they hoped had happened, not what actually occurred, a phenomenon that would plague Japanese after-action reports throughout the battle. At 11:07, American radar detected the second wave. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 107 aircraft, the largest strike of the day. Hellcats from every carrier group scrambled to intercept. This time the Americans met the Japanese 60 miles out, with altitude advantage and superior position. The slaughter was even worse than the first wave. Essex's fighters alone accounted for approximately 70 aircraft from the second raid. 70 aircraft, shot down by a single carrier's fighter squadron in less than an hour. The numbers were almost incomprehensible, suggesting not combat but execution. Japanese pilots made every mistake undertrained aviators could make, breaking formation, attempting individual attacks, circling to regroup in full view of American fighters, presenting perfect targets for pilots who had practiced deflection shooting thousands of times. A handful of bombers broke through to attack Admiral Montgomery's group again, making near misses that caused casualties on 2 carriers but achieving no hits. 4 of the 6 bombers were shot down. 1 torpedo plane launched a torpedo at Admiral Reeves's flagship, Enterprise, but the torpedo exploded harmlessly in the carrier's wake. Of 107 aircraft in the second wave, over 100 were destroyed. The Americans lost fewer than a dozen Hellcats in air-to-air combat. While the second wave was being annihilated, something far worse was happening to Admiral Ozawa's flagship. At 08:16, as the first strike was launching, the American submarine USS Albacore had maneuvered into position off Taiho's port bow. Commander James Blanchard watched through his periscope as the brand-new carrier steamed past at 27 knots, having just launched 42 aircraft. Albacore's fire control computer malfunctioned at the critical moment. Blanchard was forced to aim his spread of 6 torpedoes by visual judgment alone, leading the target, calculating speed and range in his head, knowing he would have only seconds before Taiho's escorts spotted his periscope and forced him deep. He fired. 6 torpedoes leaped from their tubes and raced toward the carrier. Taiho's lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes immediately. The carrier began an emergency turn. Destroyer escorts converged on Albacore's position, forcing her to crash dive. 5 torpedoes missed, but one, just one, struck Taiho on her starboard side forward. The explosion tore a relatively small hole in the carrier's hull, damaging the aviation fuel storage area but not seeming to threaten the ship. Taiho's damage control parties quickly shored up the bulkheads. The carrier maintained speed and continued flight operations. Admiral Ozawa remained on the bridge, directing the battle, confident his flagship would survive. But the torpedo had ruptured the aviation fuel system, and gasoline was slowly leaking into the ship, not in dramatic quantities that would have triggered immediate alarms, but in a steady seep that filled compartments with invisible, deadly vapor. The ship's ventilation system, instead of evacuating the fumes, was spreading them throughout the vessel. Taiho was becoming a floating bomb. At 11:32, as the third Japanese strike wave was forming up, disaster struck the carrier Shokaku. This veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz had survived multiple battles, but her luck had finally run out. The American submarine USS Kavala had been tracking the Japanese fleet since the previous day. Now she had maneuvered into perfect firing position off Shokaku's starboard bow. Commander Herman Kostler watched through his periscope as the carrier steamed closer. He waited until range closed to under 1,000 yards, so close he could see details on the flight deck, then fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 struck home, massive underwater explosions that tore open Shokaku's unarmored hull. Aviation fuel ignited immediately. Fire spread through the hangar deck where aircraft were being armed and fueled. Secondary explosions ripped through the carrier as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the flames. Shokaku's crew fought the fires with desperate courage, but the damage was catastrophic. By 12:12, just 40 minutes after the torpedo hits, the order came to abandon ship. At 12:20, Shokaku rolled over and sank, taking 1,200 men with her, including her captain who chose to go down with his ship in the samurai tradition. Ozawa had just lost one of his 3 heavy carriers, but sitting in Taiho's Combat Information Center, receiving fragmentary reports about Shokaku's loss while trying to coordinate 3 separate strike waves against the American fleet, he could not fully appreciate how desperate his situation had become. The 3rd strike wave found the Americans just after noon, 47 aircraft this time, a smaller force but theoretically more manageable, easier to coordinate. American fighters met them while still miles from the fleet. Of the 47 aircraft, only 7 were shot down in the initial intercept, but the formation was scattered. Small groups of Japanese aircraft wandered across the Philippine Sea, searching for targets, finding only more Hellcats. Some attempted to land on Guam to refuel. This proved to be a fatal mistake. 27 Hellcats from carriers Cowpens, Monterey, and Enterprise were already circling Orote Field on Guam, waiting for precisely this moment. As Japanese aircraft approached for landing, gear down, flaps extended, at their most vulnerable, the Hellcats pounced. It was slaughter on a scale that shocked even the American pilots. Aircraft exploded on approach. Others crashed attempting emergency maneuvers. Some made it to the runway only to be strafed to wreckage before their pilots could escape. 30 of 49 Japanese aircraft attempting to land on Guam were destroyed in minutes. The survivors were damaged beyond repair. The 4th and final strike wave of the day never found the American fleet. Launched between 1100 hours and 11:30, 130 aircraft set course east based on incorrect position reports. They searched empty ocean, found nothing, and after wandering the Philippine Sea for hours, turned for bases on Guam and Rota to refuel. Some encountered American fighters and were shot down, others ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Still others landed at Guam only to be destroyed on the ground by American airstrikes later that day. Of 130 aircraft in the 4th wave, fewer than 50 made it back to their carriers. By mid-afternoon, the scorecard was devastating. Of the 430 aircraft Admiral Ozawa had launched or attempted to launch, approximately 315 had been destroyed. American losses in air-to-air combat totaled 29 aircraft. The kill ratio was not 19-1, it was something closer to 11-1 on this first day alone. But this was only the beginning of Japan's catastrophe. At 15:32, as the sun reached its zenith over the Philippine Sea, Taiho finally paid the price for that single torpedo hit she had absorbed at 0816. For over 7 hours, aviation fuel vapors had been accumulating throughout the ship. A young damage control officer, trying to clear the fumes, ordered a ventilation fan turned on. The fan's electric motor created a single spark. Taiho exploded, not gradually, not in sections, but all at once. Every compartment filled with fuel vapor detonated simultaneously. The armored flight deck, designed to withstand bombs, buckled upward like paper. The sides of the hull blew outward. The entire ship lifted in the water from the force of the internal explosion. Admiral Ozawa, standing on the flag bridge, was thrown to the deck by the blast. When he struggled to his feet, he found himself standing on a ship that was already doomed. Fires raged throughout Taiho. Secondary explosions racked the hull. The carrier developed a list, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. At 1728, Ozawa transferred his flag to the cruiser Haguro, watching from her deck as Taiho capsized and sank. 1,600 men went down with her, including many of the combined fleet's most experienced staff officers. The newest, most powerful carrier in the Japanese fleet had survived barely 9 hours of combat before being destroyed by a single torpedo, whose damage had seemed manageable. Ozawa now commanded 7 carriers instead of 9. His air groups had been shattered, his best pilots dead or in the water, his land-based aircraft destroyed on the ground or shot from the sky. He had launched over 400 aircraft against the American fleet and achieved precisely nothing. No American carrier had been sunk, no American battleship had been damaged. The most he could claim was minor damage to 2 carriers from near misses, and the Americans were coming for him. Admiral Mitcher had spent the entire day on defense, swatting down Japanese attacks, protecting the fleet. Now, With the Japanese airstrikes spent and the enemy carriers located by afternoon reconnaissance, he wanted to attack. But Admiral Spruance remained cautious. The Japanese might be attempting to lure him away from Saipan. A night surface action could still threaten the beachhead. He ordered Mitcher to maintain position west of Saipan until morning. Many of Mitcher's pilots, and Mitcher himself, would later criticize this decision. They believed a night attack could have annihilated the entire Japanese fleet. Historians would debate Spruance's caution for decades, but Spruance had been given one mission above all others: protect the Marines at Saipan. He would not abandon that mission to chase carriers, no matter how tempting the target. The night of June 19th passed in frustration for American aviators eager to finish what they had started, but on the morning of June 20th, reconnaissance aircraft finally located Ozawa's retreating fleet, now 275 miles northwest of Task Force 58. At the extreme limit of American aircraft range, Mitcher made his decision instantly. Launch everything. Every bomber, every torpedo plane, every fighter that could reach the target. This would be a maximum effort strike, regardless of the cost in aircraft lost to fuel exhaustion on the return flight. At 16:36 on June 20th, 216 aircraft launched from 11 carriers. They climbed to altitude and set course northwest, racing against the setting sun, knowing that many of them would have to land in darkness on carriers that might not even turn on their lights. They found Ozawa's fleet at 1840, scattered across miles of ocean, retiring westward at maximum speed. The carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, Ryuho and Hio steamed in formation, surrounded by battleships and cruisers, whose anti-aircraft batteries immediately opened fire. The sky filled with shell bursts. American dive bombers attacked from high altitude while torpedo planes came in low across the water. Japanese combat air patrol fighters, pitifully few in number after the previous day's slaughter, attempted to intercept but were overwhelmed. Bombs rained down. Torpedoes streaked through the water. The carrier Hio took 2 torpedo hits. Aviation fuel ignited, the same scenario that had killed so many Japanese carriers during the war. Hio's damage control could not contain the fires. 2 hours later, she capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men down with her. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, took multiple bomb hits but survived, her crew fighting fires with suicidal determination. The carrier Chiyoda was heavily damaged. The battleship Haruna took a bomb hit. Numerous other vessels suffered varying degrees of damage. The Americans lost 20 aircraft to anti-aircraft fire and combat. But as the sun set and the attack groups turned for home, a new nightmare began. They had to fly over 200 miles back to their carriers in gathering darkness, with fuel gauges reading dangerously low. Pilots began calling Mayday over their radios as engines sputtered and died. Aircraft ditched into the Black Pacific, their crews hoping for rescue. Others circled desperately, searching for their carriers in the darkness, watching fuel needles drop to zero. Admiral Mitcher made a decision that would become legendary in naval aviation. Turn on the lights. Every light on every ship in Task Force 58 blazed into life, illuminating the ocean like a city at night, creating a beacon visible for 50 miles, guiding his pilots home even at the risk of revealing his position to Japanese submarines. Aircraft staggered back in ones and twos, landing on any carrier they could find, some crash-landing on deck, others ditching alongside ships whose crews immediately launched rescue operations. Of the 216 aircraft that had launched, 80 were lost to fuel exhaustion, crash, landings, or ditching, but most of their crews were rescued. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. The accounting was devastating for Japan. American losses: 123 aircraft, of which only 29 were lost in air-to-air combat. The rest went down from fuel exhaustion, crash landings, or anti-aircraft fire. Total personnel losses: 109 men killed or missing. Japanese losses: approximately 600 aircraft destroyed, including carrier-based and land-based. 3 fleet carriers sunk: Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio. numerous other vessels damaged, approximately 3,000 men killed, including many of Japan's most experienced pilots and naval aviators. The kill ratio for the F6F Hellcat over these 2 days approximated 19-1 when considering only air-to-air combat. 19 Japanese aircraft shot down for every Hellcat lost in aerial combat. It was a ratio that defied belief, that suggested not battle but massacre, that demonstrated how completely the balance of aerial warfare had shifted in America's favor. American pilots would call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the name capturing the one-sided nature of the fighting. But for the Japanese, it was the end of carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again conduct large-scale carrier operations. The skilled pilots lost in the Philippine Sea could never be replaced. The carriers at the bottom of the Pacific represented construction capacity and steel that Japan could not spare. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese admirals had to face an uncomfortable truth. They could no longer contest control of the Pacific skies. Every subsequent naval operation would be conducted under the shadow of American air superiority. Every amphibious assault would face minimal Japanese air opposition. The path to Tokyo lay open, protected by Hellcats that had proven themselves utterly dominant. But how had this happened? How had Japan, whose pilots had once been the best trained in the world, whose Zero had terrorized Allied aviators, whose carrier warfare doctrine had set the standard for naval aviation, been reduced to sending poorly trained pilots to die in droves against an enemy who seemed invincible? The answer lay in choices made years earlier, in training programs that emphasized quality over quantity when the war demanded both, in aircraft designs that sacrificed survivability for performance, in a military culture that valued spiritual determination over material reality, and above all, in America's ability to design, build, and deploy a weapon system specifically engineered to kill Zeros and the men who flew them. The F6F Hellcat was not the most beautiful fighter of World War II. It was bulky where the Zero was elegant, heavy where the Zero was light, straightforward where the Zero was sophisticated. But the Hellcat had been designed with one purpose: dominate the Pacific skies by any means necessary, and at Saipan, over the Philippine Sea, it had fulfilled that purpose beyond anyone's expectations. The Japanese admirals who had believed in the decisive battle, who had invoked the spirit of Tsushima, who had promised their pilots that courage and skill would overcome American material advantages, had learned the truth too late. In modern warfare, courage without adequate training was suicide. Skill without technological parity was meaningless, and spiritual determination, no matter how fierce, could not deflect 50-caliber machine gun bullets or prevent unarmored fuel tanks from exploding. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had taught a lesson that would echo through the rest of the Pacific War. The United States had achieved not just numerical superiority, but a qualitative advantage so overwhelming that Japanese pilots, no matter how brave, stood virtually no chance of survival. The 19-1 kill ratio was not an anomaly. It was the new normal. And the F6F Hellcat, that bulky, workmanlike fighter that lacked the glamour of the Mustang or the Corsair, had proven itself the most effective carrier fighter in history. In 2 years of combat, Hellcats would shoot down over 5,000 enemy aircraft, accounting for 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. But the true measure of the Hellcat's success was not in statistics. It was in the faces of American pilots who climbed into those cockpits, knowing they had every advantage over their opponents. It was in the confidence of carrier task force commanders who could project power across thousands of miles of ocean without fear of Japanese air attack. It was in the Marines and soldiers who went ashore on hostile beaches, knowing that Hellcats would protect them from air attack. The morning of June 21, 1944, aboard the cruiser Haguro, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sat in silence, reviewing the casualty reports. 3 carriers sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, thousands of men dead. The first mobile fleet, which had sailed from the Philippines with such confidence just days earlier, was now a shattered remnant fleeing westward. Ozawa drafted his report to Admiral Toyoda with a trembling hand. The phrases came with difficulty. Heavy losses sustained. unable to continue offensive operations. Request permission to withdraw. Each sentence was an admission of catastrophic failure, each word a nail in the coffin of Japanese carrier aviation. In Tokyo, when Toyoda read Ozawa's report, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes. The decisive battle he had promised, the victory that would turn the tide of the war, had become a disaster of historic proportions. The Battle of Tsushima that Ozawa had invoked had instead become Japan's own Trafalgar, a defeat so complete that recovery was impossible. Toyoda had no choice but to accept reality. He ordered Ozawa to return to base with what remained of the fleet. The decisive, battle doctrine that had guided Japanese naval strategy for decades was dead. From this point forward, Japan would fight a defensive war, attempting to delay the inevitable, inflicting casualties where possible, but never again able to challenge American naval dominance. The Imperial War Council met in emergency session on June 25th. For the first time since the war began, military leaders admitted to each other, if not yet to the Emperor, that Japan could not win. Fleet Admiral Prince Hiroyasu Fushimi spoke the unspeakable truth. Although Japanese and American equipment and methods were roughly similar, Japan could not compete with American advances in radar, fire control, pilot training, and industrial production. The loss of Saipan was now inevitable. American Marines and soldiers were grinding through Japanese defenses with methodical brutality. B-29 bombers would soon be striking the home islands, and without carrier aviation to protect the sea lanes, Japan's island garrisons would be isolated and destroyed one by one. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had promised victory, who had led Japan into war with confidence and determination, resigned in disgrace on July 18th. His resignation was a tacit admission that the war was lost. The man who had stood beside Emperor Hirohito and declared that Japan's destiny was to rule Asia had been broken by the reality that American industrial might could not be overcome by spiritual determination alone. But what of the American pilots who had achieved this victory? What did they feel as they climbed from their Hellcats after achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible? Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu, who had shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on June 19th alone, later recalled the battle with a mixture of pride and horror. "It was like an old-time turkey shoot down home," he told reporters, the phrase that would give the battle its informal name. But in private conversations years later, he spoke differently. "They kept coming," he remembered, "wave after wave. You'd shoot one down and there'd be another. They were brave, incredibly brave, but they didn't know what they were doing. You could see it in how they flew, how they reacted. These weren't the pilots who hit Pearl Harbor. These were kids, barely trained, flying aircraft their instructors had told them were the best in the world, and we were killing them by the hundreds." Japanese pilots who survived told stories of watching their wingmen explode, of seeing entire formations wiped out in minutes, of the growing realization that they stood no chance against American fighters. Those few who made it back to their carriers described a sense of hopelessness, the understanding that Japan had sent them to die in a battle that could not be won. Ensign Sakae Yamashita, one of the few surviving Japanese pilots, later wrote in his diary, "We were told the Americans feared us, that our spirit would overcome their machines. They lied. The Americans did not fear us. They destroyed us with the ease of swatting flies. Our Zeros, which we were taught were invincible, burned like paper lanterns. I watched 7 of my squadron mates die in less than 10 minutes. I do not know how I survived. I do not know why I survived when so many better pilots did not." The technological gap between the Hellcat and the Zero had become unbridgeable by 1944. The Zero that had terrorized Allied pilots in early 1942 was essentially the same aircraft in mid-1944. Some improvements had been made, slightly more powerful engines, better radios, but the fundamental design remained unchanged. The Zero was still fast and maneuverable, still had excellent range, still climbed well at low altitude, but it was also still unarmored, still lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, still had a tendency to catch fire when hit. And against the Hellcats, 50 caliber machine guns, those weaknesses were fatal. A single burst from a Hellcat could set a Zero ablaze. 2 seconds of sustained fire could tear a Zero apart completely. The Hellcat, meanwhile, had been designed with every lesson learned from early war combat. Its cockpit was armored, protecting the pilot from behind and below. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, using a rubber compound that would swell when punctured, closing small holes before fuel could leak. Its engine was powerful enough to maintain high speed, even with battle damage. Its wings were strong enough to withstand high-G maneuvers that would have torn a Zero apart. Grumman, the manufacturer, had built the Hellcat according to a simple philosophy: keep the pilot alive. If the pilot survived, he gained experience. If he gained experience, he became more effective. If he became more effective, he trained others. The cycle of improvement was self-reinforcing. Japan had followed the opposite philosophy: build the lightest, fastest, most maneuverable fighter possible, even if it meant sacrificing pilot protection. In 1941 and early 1942, when Japanese pilots were the best trained in the world, this approach worked. Skill and experience compensated for aircraft vulnerability, but by 1944, when experienced pilots had been killed and replaced by hastily trained novices, the vulnerabilities became catastrophic. The kill ratio at the Turkey shoot reflected this perfectly. American pilots in armored aircraft with 2 years of training massacred Japanese pilots in unarmored aircraft with 6 months of training. It was not combat, it was industrial slaughter, the application of American material superiority to the business of killing. Admiral Mitchell understood this better than most. In his after-action report, he wrote, "The Hellcat has proven itself the most effective carrier fighter in the world, but the Hellcat alone did not win this battle. Superior pilot, training, better tactics, radar detection, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, and numerical superiority all contributed. The Japanese fought with courage, but courage alone is insufficient against material advantage of this magnitude." The strategic implications of the Turkey shoot extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. With Japanese carrier aviation effectively destroyed, the entire strategic situation in the Pacific changed. American carrier task forces could now operate with virtual impunity, striking targets throughout the Pacific without fear of effective Japanese air opposition. The capture of Saipan was completed on July 9th, after a month of brutal fighting that cost the lives of over 3,000 Americans and 29,000 Japanese. But Saipan's capture meant that B-29 Superfortress bombers could now reach Tokyo. The strategic bombing campaign that would devastate Japan's cities and industry could begin. Guam fell on August 10th. Tinian was secured by August 1st. The entire Marianas chain was now in American hands, providing bases for the final assault on Japan. And throughout these operations, Hellcats provided air cover, sweeping aside the minimal Japanese air opposition, protecting the invasion fleets, supporting ground forces. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 would be the last major naval engagement of the Pacific War. Japan committed virtually every remaining surface combatant in a desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte. But without carrier air cover, Japanese battleships and cruisers were exposed to overwhelming American air attack. The Hellcats of Task Force 38 tore into Japanese surface forces with devastating effect. During Leyte Gulf, Captain David McCampbell, the same pilot who had led the first interception at the Turkey shoot, achieved the most remarkable single-mission kill record in U.S. naval aviation history. On October 24th, McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, encountered a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft heading toward American carriers. Just 2 Hellcats against 60 enemy aircraft. McCampbell attacked anyway. For over an hour, he and Rushing harried the Japanese formation, breaking up their attack, shooting down aircraft after aircraft. McCampbell personally shot down 9 enemy planes that day, 7 Zeros and 2 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars. Rushing shot down 6. Together, they destroyed 15 aircraft and scattered the formation so completely that the surviving Japanese pilots aborted their mission. McCampbell would end the war as the U.S. Navy's top ace, with 34 confirmed kills, all achieved flying the F6F Hellcat. When asked about his success, he gave credit to his aircraft. The Hellcat would do anything you asked of it. It was fast, powerful, and tough. It could take damage that would have killed other fighters. And it gave you confidence. When you climbed into a Hellcat, you knew you had the best fighter in the Pacific. That confidence permeated American carrier aviation by late 1944. Pilots who had once feared the Zero now hunted Japanese aircraft with aggressive determination. The psychological balance had shifted completely. American pilots expected to win, Japanese pilots expected to die. This psychological shift manifested most dramatically in Japan's adoption of kamikaze tactics in October 1944. The kamikaze, the divine wind that would supposedly turn the tide through suicide attacks, was not a sign of Japanese determination. It was an admission of defeat, a recognition that conventional aerial combat was no longer viable. When pilots can no longer expect to survive combat, when training is insufficient to achieve military objectives through normal tactics, suicide becomes the only remaining option. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who formalized the kamikaze program, admitted this openly. In my opinion, there is only one way of assuring that our meager strength will be effective to maximum degree. That is to organize suicide attack units. The phrase meager strength said everything. Japan no longer had the aircraft, the pilots, or the training to contest the skies conventionally. Suicide was the only tactic that might, possibly, inflict significant damage. The kamikaze would prove frighteningly effective at Leyte Gulf, and especially at Okinawa, where suicide attacks sank dozens of American ships and killed thousands of sailors. But even kamikaze tactics could not overcome American material advantage. For every kamikaze that hit a target, dozens more were shot down by Hellcats or anti-aircraft fire. The F6F kill ratio remained devastatingly high throughout 1945. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Hellcat had compiled a combat record unmatched in aviation history. 12,275 Hellcats built, 66,530 combat sorties flown, 5,163 enemy aircraft destroyed, an overall kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1 in aerial combat. 307 Hellcat pilots became aces, achieving 5 or more kills. The Hellcat accounted for 75% of all U.S., Navy, and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific. No other fighter, before or since, has dominated its opponents so completely. The lessons of the turkey shoot resonated far beyond World War II. Military planners recognized that modern warfare favored nations that could combine superior technology, superior training, and superior numbers. Courage and determination remained important, but they were no longer sufficient. The side with better aircraft, better radar, better tactics, and better trained pilots would win regardless of the enemy's fighting spirit. This lesson would influence military aviation development throughout the Cold War and beyond. The U.S. Air Force and Navy invested heavily in pilot training, creating programs like Top Gun that emphasized realistic combat preparation. Aircraft designers focused on survivability and pilot protection, not just performance, and military doctrine emphasized the importance of technological superiority as a force multiplier. The F6F Hellcat itself had a surprisingly short service life. By the war's end in 1945, jet aircraft were already appearing. The Hellcat was rapidly obsolete compared to jets that flew twice as fast and climbed 3 times as quickly. By 1954, just 9 years after the war ended, the last Navy Hellcat was retired from active service. But the Hellcat's legacy endured. Museum displays across the United States feature preserved F6Fs, many restored to flying condition. Airshow crowds watch with awe as vintage Hellcats perform, their distinctive sound and profile evoking an era when American naval aviation achieved dominance through engineering excellence and tactical brilliance. Approximately 70 F6F Hellcats survive in museums and private collections worldwide. 7 remain airworthy, all based in the United States, regularly flown at air shows and commemorative events. Each flight is a reminder of the 12,000 aircraft that rolled off Grumman's assembly lines, the tens of thousands of pilots who flew them in combat, and the 5,000 enemy aircraft they destroyed. The pilots who flew Hellcats remembered them with affection and respect. In veteran reunions decades after the war, former Navy aviators would gather and share stories of the aircraft that had kept them alive. Many spoke of the Hellcat as a friend, a guardian, a machine that had saved their lives when they should have died. One pilot, Captain Ray Hawkins, who achieved 14 kills flying Hellcats, put it simply: "The Hellcat was not a beautiful aircraft. It was bulky, heavy, and straightforward. But it was honest. It did what it was designed to do, without drama or complications. It kept you alive. And at the end of the day, that's what mattered most." The Japanese admirals who had planned Operation Eigo, who had invoked Tsushima, who had believed that one decisive battle could turn the tide, never fully understood what defeated them. Some blamed American numerical superiority. Others pointed to technological advantages like radar and proximity fuses. Still others insisted that Japanese pilots had fought courageously, but were overwhelmed by circumstances. All of these explanations contained elements of truth, but they missed the fundamental reality. Japan had lost the Battle of the Philippine Sea before the first aircraft launched. The outcome was determined by choices made years earlier, by decisions about how to train pilots, how to design aircraft, how to allocate resources, how to prepare for a long war against an industrial superpower. The United States had recognized that modern war required not just courage but massive material investment. It required aircraft that could absorb damage. Pilots trained for years, not months. Radar to detect enemies at range, tactics based on realistic assessment of strengths and weaknesses, and above all, the industrial capacity to produce weapons in quantities that overwhelmed any opponent. The F6F Hellcat embodied all of these principles. It was not the most elegant solution to carrier aviation, but it was the most effective. And in war, effectiveness matters more than elegance. On June 19, 1944, when Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu climbed into his Hellcat and headed toward 400 incoming Japanese aircraft, he carried with him every advantage American industry and ingenuity could provide. 2 years of training, a rugged aircraft designed to keep him alive, radar that had detected the enemy at 50 miles, tactical doctrine written by men who had studied every aspect of aerial combat. The Japanese pilots he faced had courage. They had determination. They had fighting spirit. But they had 6 months of training, unarmored aircraft that caught fire when hit, no radar, and tactics based on assumptions that were no longer true. The outcome was inevitable. 19 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American fighter lost, a kill ratio that demonstrated not just victory but total dominance. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not a battle. It was a demonstration of what happens when material advantage meets inadequate preparation, when industrial might confront spiritual determination, when reality defeats mythology. The Japanese admirals never imagined Hellcats would shoot down 19 planes for every one lost at Saipan. They could not imagine it because accepting that reality meant accepting that everything they believed about warfare, about Japanese superiority, about the power of spirit over matter, was wrong. But reality does not care about beliefs. The waters of the Philippine Sea accepted the wreckage of 600 Japanese aircraft and 3 carriers without judgment. The laws of physics do not bend to accommodate national mythology, and the F6F Hellcat, that workmanlike, unglamorous fighter, had proven that in modern warfare, the side with better technology, better training, and better tactics wins, every time. The lesson echoed through the remainder of World War II and continues to resonate decades later. Courage remains essential, spirit matters, determination makes a difference. But in the end, wars are won by nations that combine human excellence with material superiority, that train their warriors thoroughly and equip them properly, that learn from their mistakes and adapt to changing circumstances. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot taught that lesson in blood and fire over the Philippine Sea, and the F6F Hellcat, the bulky, honest, effective fighter that dominated the Pacific skies, became the embodiment of American naval aviation at its finest. Not beautiful, but deadly. Not glamorous, but effective. Not legendary before the battle, but immortal after. 19-1. The number that Japanese admirals never imagined. The ratio that changed the course of the Pacific War. The proof that American naval aviation had achieved dominance so complete that Japan could never recover. The fate of the empire had indeed rested on that battle, just as Admiral Toyoda had declared. But the outcome was the opposite of what he had promised. Instead of the decisive Japanese victory that would save the empire, the Battle of the Philippine Sea became the decisive American victory that doomed it. And in the cockpits of those F6F Hellcats, young American pilots had achieved something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They had not just won a battle, they had destroyed an entire enemy air force in 2 days of combat. They had proven that courage without adequate preparation is simply not enough. They had demonstrated the power of American industrial might applied to the science of aerial combat. The Hellcat would serve until the end of the war, shooting down thousands more Japanese aircraft, protecting invasion fleets, supporting ground operations, clearing the skies for B-29 bombers that would reduce Japanese cities to ashes. But its moment of greatest glory came over the Philippine Sea in June 1944, when it achieved a kill ratio that defied belief and changed the course of history. 19-1, the impossible made real. The statistic that told the story of American dominance and Japanese disaster, the number that Japanese admirals never imagined, but that American pilots achieved through skill, training, and a fighter designed to keep them alive while killing the enemy. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the battle where the Hellcat became legend, the moment when Japanese admirals learned that faith in spiritual superiority could not overcome material reality. And the day that American naval aviation proved itself master of the Pacific skies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.